Welcome, everybody, to another exciting episode of Leading with Data, the podcast where we talk about the intersection of data, the future, strategy, and so much more. And I am incredibly fired up to have a VIP guest on today, Hal Stern. Hal is the Vice President and Chief Information Officer of Research and Development at Janssen Pharmaceuticals, which is one of the Johnson & Johnson companies. I am so thrilled to have you with us today, Hal. Thanks so much for joining.
Well, Jason, spoken like truly someone who's had a snow day there today in Texas. So thanks for having me on this show.
It was a very rare snow day here in Austin, Texas, and extremely exciting for my daughter. So thank you for noticing. So Hal, I love to always start off our show with just a bit of background about you. So how did you get into your current role?
So I did not start off in life sciences. I actually started off as a reform system administrator. Worked for a variety of technology companies, primarily at Sun Microsystems. I was there from 1989 through the dot-com boom, through the dot-com bust, through the long, slow build-out of the internet, and then eventually the Oracle acquisition. I left Sun Microsystems in 2010. I went to Juniper Networks, where I was a VP of network architecture, network management, and network virtualization. And honestly, after more than 20 years of commuting back and forth to California and building out products, I discovered really three things. Number one is I did not like spending a lot of time on airplanes. Number two, I was much happier when I was actually designing solutions rather than products. Much more of a, what's it going to go do for the customer or the consumer, rather than, hey, here's a really cool tool. Here's some new bright and shiny technology. And the third thing is, there are a number of problems I found that were borderline intractable. And one of the things I found fascinating about networking is the problems were exceptionally large. They're all graph oriented. They're all very data rich. And a lot of them we simply can't solve perfectly. How do you optimize a network? How do you optimize bandwidth? Those are all relatively unsolved and too complex to be solved problems. If you look at life sciences, you have the same set of problems, but they're 2 to 5 orders of magnitude larger. And the societal impact of solving them is significant. And I had a friend of mine who I'd known from my Sun Microsystems days who gave me a call and said, hey, would you be interested in coming over to Merck? This is about 7 years ago. I said, wow, it's in New Jersey. So, okay, check mark, no more airplanes. It's life sciences. So really hard problems, really interesting, very data driven, check mark. And it has a really great, social impact, third check mark. So I switched industries and literally spent the first 6 months just trying to figure out which end was up. And when you come out of technology and you go to the enterprise space, it's not about the cool technology. It's about what are you going to do for the business? How are you bringing them insights and innovation that matter to them? And that was even at that ripe old age as a technologist, it was a lot of a learning curve for me. It was sort of a not a straight up learning curve, but one that took a while to climb. So it was at Merck in the office of the CIO, and then in Merck Research Labs for about 6 years, and got a call from J&J. And when J&J calls, you answer. It's like in the early days of technology, if IBM called, you answered. Joined them about a year and a half ago, and really obviously exciting time. I used to joke around that every time I switched companies, something interesting would happen. In my very first job, the company had a large contract with IBM. IBM canceled, so people were walking out with boxes my first day on the job. My first day at Sun Microsystems, the company announced a loss and layoffs. I was like, okay, another great time. So this time I had a global pandemic. So I was, I don't know whether it's I'm getting better at it or the world's just getting crazier or both.
Wow, that's one amazing journey. And two things sort of jump out at me there. One is that you did make this big transition, right? You shifted gears in terms of industries, which is a huge deal. And then the second was the desire to have social impact. And I think so often when people talk about data, we talk about outcomes and so forth, but I think the social impact piece for me is incredibly inspiring and very important. And I'm really fired up that that's something that clearly motivates you. And I'd love to ask just sort of a follow-up to that, if it's okay. Is there anything that you learned about yourself through this period of time? I mean, you sort of made the joke of each of these new things you started, something sort of awful happened and you still made it amazing and were able to help these companies. But is there anything you learned about yourself sort of going through this process as you change different sort of careers and then ultimately industries and so forth? Anything that you learned about yourself?
I think what you're well, I guess two things. First is I've always been something of a misfit, and for a while I thought of that as perhaps a strange badge of honor. And just recently I finished Olga Kazan's book Weird, and it was like I read the story of my life but told from a perspective of someone who was a Russian immigrant who grew up in Texas, as opposed to a Ukrainian immigrant who grew up in New Jersey. Um, or the grandson of Ukrainian immigrants. And but it was like, wow, that's what it's like. It's okay to be weird. It's okay to be different. It's okay to. One of my HR partners once called me countercultural because I didn't like wearing socks. And I always thought that was weird. It's like, well, no, I just don't like wearing socks because I don't like socks. And yes, I know that's an accepted convention, but that's just me. And rather than, I guess, feeling shame for that, I was like, okay, that's just who I am. And along the way, this sort of coming to grips with your unique perspective and how you look at problems and how you think about solving problems. I benefited along the way from, I would say, a large number of really good, really serious mentors who were not afraid of the weird. The guy who hired me at Merck used to call us the island of misfit toys, and not not too facetiously, because he just collected people who didn't have a better place to be. Um, for a while, I worked with Bert Sutherland at Sun Microsystems, and Bert, when he was at Xerox PARC, brought together all these amazing researchers in very large scale systems integration and computer design and human computer interface. And every time you use a mouse or a heads up display, thank Bert Sutherland for work that he did now 50 years ago by investing in the weird. And I think one of the realizations I've had is, it's good. It's good to be different. It's good to be, nonconformist. David Epstein covers this in his book Range to a very, very high degree of detail in terms of how you find different skills that people bring, and how you really build a team of to put it not too bluntly, to build a team of weirdos, and that's a good thing. So
Well,
I'm proud to be weird.
there you go. Well, as I myself have taken a very unconventional path, so I find great inspiration in what you just shared. I mean, I started college really early and then left college to write a book and ended up sleeping on the floor of a garage apartment, and then ultimately been pursuing this now for more than 20 years, and it's been a blast and completely unpredictable. So,
So author, rock and roller, data scientist. It's all you're sleeping on the floor of someone's garage at some point.
yeah, I mean, that's just the way it goes. And I
Mhm.
love the journey. It's definitely been an exciting one. Well, so switching gears a little bit into the data conversation, I'd love to know, you've obviously seen data through the lens of a lot of different companies and vice versa. You've seen, a lot of companies through the lens of data. What do you think is the most important decision that you have made using data, and how did it work out?
I'll, I'm going to give you an inverted answer to that.
Perfect.
The decisions, it's the decisions we haven't made because I don't think we had enough data. And as we have gotten significantly better at data science, it is still largely pattern matching. And we train our machine learning systems based on what we hope is a sufficiently broad and representative input set, and we vectorize it. We differentiate the vectors. We build up weights and say, okay, this is really good. I can now differentiate a spider crawling out of a corner from a starfish, even though they both look like they have 5 legs and a small circular body. I'm pretty good at that. And yet I can take any variety of image recognition systems and find adversarial inputs for them, whether it's fried chicken and labradoodles or chihuahuas and blueberry muffins. You can fool a lot of systems because they haven't been sufficiently trained with a broad enough input. Human disease is effectively an adversarial input to all the immune systems of your body or all of your normal endocrine systems of your body. It just is. So our body's pretty good at this pattern matching of, oh, that doesn't belong here. Let's go kill those cells. And we can evolve it along the way. It's what vaccinations do. It's what our learned immune system does. Um, and yet we still get sick, and we do that because disease evolves, and because we evolve. Um, so as we want to understand human biology, we want to understand the mechanism of disease. I think people figured, well, once we've sequenced the genome, that's it. The drugs will automatically discover themselves. We'll just feed everything into Google, and the answer will come out the other end. I wish it were that simple, but it's not. It's really, we don't understand enough, and the combinations are so computationally complex and so incredibly large. Uh, in terms of the input space that we have to be careful not to jump at the bad science. I guess the non-answer is resisting the temptation to look for correlation without very, very strong scientific causation. And I think we're getting better at it, but it is going to be using machine learning to amplify what the scientists do, not to replace them. You still, there's a lot of scientific discovery we just haven't gotten into. Hopefully we'll make it easier, better, faster, but we still have to go do it.
Yeah, it's brilliant. You know, one of the things that I know I've heard the team over at Molecula say is, you know, you still need people, right, in order to make all of this really work. And that, you know, we can really bring out the strengths of everybody when you approach this the right way, which gets me really excited and to hear you say that. So sort of going in a different direction then, since you already went off track, which is what I love, what is an unexpected opinion you have about data or the future of data? I'm really excited to hear this answer.
So we tend to think of data like a commodity. You know, it's oil, as it was on the cover of The Economist, and it's not. It's not, because a commodity, whether it's orange juice or bacon or oil, you use it once and then it's gone. You definitely do not recycle bacon. But data, we use it and we reuse it and we remix it and we find new value in it. It's music. And that is the change that the music industry went through when we began to not just digitize music, but realize that there was enormous value in remixing music, in sampling. And this is something that has happened. If you go back to the early days of bebop, it was the staple of jazz musicians. And then in the early days of hip hop, the notion of sampling and remixing, you know, very much fueled an industry where you had older artists being given a new audience and new artists being able to draw on an incredible musical legacy. And to bring those two things together created something that not only cross genres, but really helped build out, you know, I would say a real rebirth of the music industry. We need to do the same thing with data. We need to stop thinking of it as something that you use once or something that's owned by one person. The value of data is going to be, can I combine these things together? Should I combine them together? Do I respect the rights of everybody when I combine them together? Let me give you an example of where this gets weird. So, you know, I am now, if you could see me with my face for radio, holding up my iPhone. Okay, my iPhone is a very, very good location sensor. Tells you where I am. That's great. If I want to find myself in New York City or route finding with Waze, it's wonderful. If I look at my location over time, now you know how fast I'm going. So now you know my position and you also know my velocity. It's also my music player. And it also collects all of my self-care health data. And individually, those things are very, very useful and not particularly interesting. Okay, you know, your heart rate's a little elevated in the morning and you drive out to, you know, your office in New Jersey every day. But when you put them together, okay, Stern drives 75 miles an hour at 8:30 in the morning on an interstate highway listening to Norwegian death metal with an elevated heart rate. Oh my goodness, if you're my insurance company, like all the red lights just went up on the dashboard. So individually, who cares? Put them together, remix them, and you start to say, wow, this is interesting. And I look at that as an enormous privacy incursion. I'm not happy with that. So if you want to look at my data, you can look at those things. I'm fine to have Google go tell me where I am. I'm fine to help it, you know, have it help me route, you know, to some restaurant I've never been to before. But don't do that while also looking at my playlist and my heart rate and, you know, the time of day. Because at some point you've crossed the line of what you could fairly do in remixing that data.
Got it. I love that. Such an interesting opinion and perspective. I really like that. And I love the fact that you inform it sort of coming from all these different backgrounds, which leads into my next question. So given that you talked about the Sun experience and then Merck and J&J and so forth, when you think about your leadership roles, because you've had a lot of them, what do you think is most important when it comes to being an effective leader now? I mean, you've learned and seen a lot. What do you think is most important? I particularly like the angle you take about weird and, you know, misfit toys and so forth. Obviously that resonates with me, but what do you think is most important?
Again, I'll give you, it's a two-sided answer. First is a real focus on ethics. Should we be doing this? You know, is it the right thing to do? And are we doing it the right way? And I think these ethical arguments come up again and again and again in engineering context. So New York City replaced almost all the turnstiles on the MTA over the last couple of years. So they used to have the regular turnstiles that were, you know, slightly higher than waist height, about the height of a table. And if you were significantly more athletic than me, you could hop over them. You're fare stealing. They replace what they call the high entry turnstiles. They look like a set of combs that interlock, and they run floor to ceiling. So fare theft is impossible. It just makes evacuation a lot slower. So was that ethical? Was that a good it was a good engineering decision from a fare theft point of view? Was it a good engineering from a public safety point of view? And I think the more we start to look at the data that we have, we have to keep in mind that there are people on the other side of that data, whether it's someone whose behavior you're looking at online, or if I'm trying to figure out, what the mechanism of disease is and how I measure the disease progression. There are always people involved. That's why we do this, whether it's their behavior or their purchasing power or them as individuals who are talking about their healthcare, and we have to be unbelievably respectful of that. And I would say the second part of that is, so now, we say, okay, we're comfortable with the ethics of what we're doing. Should we even do it? Is this our market? One of my very early mentors, we were talking about future design of computer workstations, would frequently trot out what I call the wheelbarrow example. And, people would say, well, if we build a workstation that had this graphics card, we could go after this market. If it had this sound card, we could go after the gamer market. And eventually it'd say, but those are not our markets. That's true, but that's not what we do. And I think sometimes it's very, very tempting to say, well, we should go after this market because it's a $3 billion market. Wheelbarrows are a $3 billion market. But if you are in the computer workstation business, if you're in the PC business, that's not your market. Now, yes, you could take a PC and bolt it to a wheelbarrow, but it doesn't mean you've now entered the wheelbarrow market. It just means you have a really dirty PC. And you have to be very careful. There's so much going on. And again, there's so much overlap, I would say now. The lines, what used to be a clear edge between industries has truly blurred. And that's whether you think about the impact of networking or the impact of being online most of the time, or the way in which we use data. The fact that all of our businesses are networked, the lines between where one business ends and the next one begins are blurry. And so you have to eventually say, what's the edge of my business? And I'm going to go that far, but no further, because then I start to dilute what I can really do. So there's a business ethics, which is, be true to the core of what you do. And there's very much an operational ethics, which is, well, should we even be doing it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I know I've seen lots and lots of companies try to veer into attractive markets that aren't core to them because it was a shiny nickel, and it's definitely not worked out for most of them. So that's some good advice to heed there. Just because it's a big market doesn't mean it's the one you should go into.
Always think like, is this a wheelbarrow or not? Because again, you can always enter the wheelbarrow market by taking whatever you have and putting it in the wheelbarrow. You're now a wheelbarrow maker, but
yeah,
doesn't necessarily mean it's a good idea.
Well, so these two are sort of combined now. I'm thinking about my next question. So you've sort of answered this. Maybe you have a different way to approach it, but I would still like to hear how has data shaped your overall leadership strategy?
I think again, it's first and foremost is that realization that there are people on the other side, right? Whether we're talking about operational efficiency or organizational efficiency, we're talking about people's lives. We're talking about what they do. The second is to truly understand the domain of the data, that we understand what it means. We understand if what we have is sufficient, if what we have is meaningful, if we're using the data appropriately to go build our models. Again, I think when you look at classical computer science, so I'm going to write the code and you're going to give me the inputs, I'm going to feed them in, and out comes a very deterministic output. The answer is 42. And when you talk about things like machine learning, what you're getting is a probabilistic answer. We think this is what it is, and with a high degree of probability, but there are 3 or 4 other things it could be. As soon as you start dealing in probabilities, you want to make sure that the way in which you generate them is really, really, really accurate. I'm a big fan of Annie Duke and the book she's written about decision making, and she's always talking about how you collect more information. She comes at this from the perspective of a world-class professional poker player, but how do you collect information, particularly when the information you're getting may be incomplete or intentionally incorrect, to build your models. So, first up, realize it's always about people. Second, is make sure the data and the models that we have are applicable and that you really have confidence in them. And I would say the third thing is to use this to make explainable decisions. I think a lot of times people always see reality from their perspective. They'll look at anything from how many people are working on a project to what they think you're spending on a project to what they think the demographics of a particular situation are. And when you come back with data to explain it, not in a vindictive way, but in a way to be able to say, here's what the data show, and you can explain why you made a particular decision or why you feel a particular approach is the correct one. Um, it does it in a way which is very hard to argue with. It's like you can keep score in a game, and the score is the score. Now you can argue about what the referee call was, you can argue about who's a better player, but at the end of the day, it's the score of the game that counts, because that's something you can count. And again, people might argue about how you got there, but the scoreboard sort of tells this immutable truth at the end. So you think about, you want to go explain something in the context in which you're removing all interpretation from it. You're coming up with this common language to help people understand why and how you've made decisions. And it's very, it's getting increasingly challenging because of the volume of data we have. But it's also increasingly important because absent that explanation and transparency, people will find their own conclusions.
Oh, brilliant. I love that. Okay, so now let's go from sort of what we've learned to looking ahead. What is one prediction you have about the future of data and business? Love to hear. I can't wait to hear this one, actually. I'm so ready for this.
All right, so let me ask you a question. Do you recycle?
Do I recycle?
Yeah, do you recycle? Do you recycle your glass at home?
Yes. Uh-huh.
Okay, so I'm going to drive over to your house later on, because a mutual friend of ours told me where you live, and I'm going to take all the wine bottles out of your recycling and take pictures of them and post them on Instagram and wine shame you for drinking bad wine. You are suddenly less interested in recycling. And this is the trail of data we leave behind. Now, it is we tend to think, well, I don't really, worry about if I'm going to use these free online services, and I know they're collecting my personal data, and in exchange for advertising dollars, but I'm okay with that. And the point at which it turns into wine shaming, it's not okay anymore. And this idea of what do we consent to be done with our data, and how do we consent, for our data to be used and to be remixed, is going to be important. And I think the prediction I'll make is what we saw happen in the publishing world, where copyright in the analog world was very, very simple. You have a book, you buy a book, it is an instantiation of the book, it is a copyrighted piece of writing, and that was it. And very few people went out and photocopied the entire book and passed out copies to their friends. It just wasn't cost effective. It's better to go buy a book and give it to your friend. With digital assets, now we have a change in that, which is it's very easy to make copies. So what we saw happen, largely led by Lawrence Lessig and the idea of the Creative Commons, was this idea that you could have multiple degrees of rights. Can you share it? Do you have to attribute it? Can you commercialize it? Do you have to attribute it to the original author? And in doing that, independent artists like Randall Monroe, the guy who creates the XKCD comics, found a livelihood. So Randall does no advertising. He doesn't have to. It's all word of mouth. But the fact is, he gives you permission to use his cartoons. And I dare you to find a technical presentation now that does not have an XKCD panel in at least one of the slides. And if it's done correctly, it will say XKCD. There will be a link to it. There's an attribution. There's a reference to it. It's not commercialized, so no one's making books out of his comics. But he created an audience of millions of people who follow him, who do buy his commercial products. And he created a market out of this by not in a way that the historical view of copyrighted print matter would have ever thought possible. How do we do the same thing with our data? What is the equivalent of Creative Commons for my personal data? Can you share it? Do you have to attribute it? What can you do with it? How many times can you share it? Should you notify me if you find anything weird in there? You'd be surprised. Some people are like, oh, absolutely want to know. And other people are like, I do not want to know, because I don't want to know what's going to go wrong with me down the road. I'd rather live my life and find out. And it's not up to us as practitioners in the healthcare space to decide that for people. We have to be respectful of the data, the sources of the data. Again, it's people on the other side of it. And I think we're going to see, much as we did in Creative Commons as applied to copyrighted material, either going to see a real shift, a real groundswell of how we think about our personal data, our behavioral data, our healthcare data, even our location data, as something of value and something around which we want to wrap this much finer grained, much more multidimensional view of how we share it and how we derive value, and essentially how we steward it on behalf of others.
Oh, love that. I love that. You did not disappoint on that one. Woo! That was phenomenal.
Well, thank you.
So,
Thank you.
yeah, I happen to be really interested in data privacy and how people think about data, and which side do we err on? How sophisticated are people when it comes to their data and so forth? So, I'm really glad that you talked about that specifically. And so, the last thing, I always like to end with this question is: so, what is your favorite leadership quote, saying, or motto, and why is that the one?
So, Pat Riley, basketball coach, um, wrote this great book called The Winner Within, and in there he talks about his time with the Lakers, and one of his non-starting players came to him and said, "Hey, coach, contract year, I need more time." And he said, "Great, those are the starting five. Go over and tell which of your teammates that you will be taking his minutes. And when you can do that with a straight face, I'll play you. But if you don't feel comfortable doing it, why are you asking me?" And I think this idea of don't ask your manager to be your apologist, rather get to the point where your value is very, very clear and your manager becomes your promoter, your advisor, your advocate. uh, it's a very difficult thing to do, because you always expect, and again, your manager as your coach has some responsibility to help you develop, to help you grow in that. But it should never be, well, I need X, so please go get me X. Like, well, if you can't say, to the person that you're taking X away from, that that's okay, why would you ever expect someone else to go do it for you? And you'll find this conversation pop up again and again, whether you're talking about promotion or you're talking about partnership, or again, you're talking about things in a more classic coaching or sports context. It's a example that has served me well, because it focuses the conversation not on what you don't do, but how do we get you to do more of the things that you either do well or that you want to do well, because that's how you earn your playing time, whether it's on the court or in the corporate boardroom. It's how you earn your playing time.
Oh, Hal, whew, this has been phenomenal. I love that. I love that. Well, I want to thank you again for joining us today. This has been so full of insights, everything I hoped and more. I want to give a big shout out to Molecula for sponsoring the podcast and making all this possible. Please make sure that you follow the show, write a great review. We'd love to hear from you. And please be on the lookout for the next show. Thanks again, Hal. It's been an awesome Leading with Data podcast with you.
Thank you for having me.